Dr. Samuel Mitchell's bloodied hands trembled as he reached deeper into the lioness's birth canal, her amber eyes locked onto his with desperate trust. The 68-year-old veterinarian had delivered thousands of animals in his lifetime, but never with hyenas circling just beyond the firelight and armed poachers closing in from the darkness. This wasn't supposed to be a life-or-death surgery in the African wilderness. Esther Johnson screamed from behind him as Marcus Kane's rifle barrel emerged from the acacia trees, the red laser dot dancing across the laboring lioness's flank. The camping equipment scattered as Jackson Thompson dove for cover, his radio crackling with panicked voices from base camp. Sam's mind flashed to another pair of eyes, his grandson Tommy's 10 years ago when everything went wrong. The same helpless trust, the same desperate need to save someone he'd already failed. "Everyone stay back or the lion dies!" Marcus shouted, his voice cracking with desperation. 20 minutes of daylight remained. 4 lives hung in the balance. How had a simple volunteer mission become this nightmare? Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching from now. Let's continue with the story. 3 days earlier, the morning sun had painted the Kenyan savanna in shades of gold that reminded Dr. Samuel Mitchell of his late wife's favorite autumn sweater. At 68, with weathered hands that bore the scars of 40 years treating everything from ranch horses to house cats, Sam had thought his days of adventure were long behind him. The rickety bush plane that delivered him to the wildlife preserve had rattled his arthritic bones, but nothing could shake the determination that had driven him halfway around the world. Another white savior come to rescue Africa? Jackson Thompson's voice carried the weight of skepticism earned through years of watching well-meaning volunteers fumble through 2-week safari experiences. The 45-year-old former Marine stood 6'3" in his ranger uniform, his dark skin gleaming with perspiration as he supervised the unloading of medical supplies. 3 tours in Afghanistan had taught him to read people quickly, and something about this particular volunteer felt different. Sam adjusted Tommy's old baseball cap, the one item he'd carried everywhere since the accident, and met Jack's challenging stare. "Son, I'm not here to save Africa. I'm here to save myself." The honesty in his voice seemed to surprise them both. Across the dusty compound, 72-year-old Esther Mae Johnson was already elbow-deep in her second week of volunteer work, teaching basic veterinary care to local women with the patience of someone who'd raised 3 children and buried 1 husband. Her gray hair was pulled back in a practical bun, and her Georgia accent softened even the most technical medical terms. The Social Security check that barely covered her medications back home had somehow stretched to cover this trip, her last chance, she'd told herself, to matter to someone again. "Honey, you look like you've seen a ghost," Esther observed as Sam approached the medical tent, her nurse's intuition picking up on the tremor in his hands that had nothing to do with age. She'd learned to read pain in people's faces during 30 years of hospital work, and this man carried the kind of grief that never fully healed. The wildlife preserve stretched endlessly in every direction, a patchwork of grassland and acacia trees that had remained unchanged for millennia. Here, in one of Kenya's most remote conservation areas, the ancient rhythms of life and death played out far from the complications of modern civilization. Tourist vehicles rarely ventured this deep into the wilderness, leaving the work to dedicated researchers and the handful of volunteers brave enough to endure the isolation. Jack's radio crackled with the evening report. Lion tracks near the main water source, signs of a pregnant female in distress. The dry season had been particularly harsh this year, forcing wildlife into increasingly desperate competition for dwindling resources. In the distance, the haunting call of a male lion echoed across the savanna, a sound that spoke of territory, protection, and the timeless struggle for survival that connected all living things. None of them could have imagined that within 72 hours their lives would become inextricably linked with that of a lioness fighting for her cubs' lives. The call came over Jack's radio at 5:47 a.m., shattering the pre-dawn silence like a gunshot. Base to Ranger 1, we've got lion tracks at Water Point 7. Female appears to be in distress, possibly injured. Jack's weathered fingers gripped the radio tighter as he processed the information. In his 15 years of conservation work, distressed wildlife usually meant one thing: human interference. Sam was already pulling on his boots when Jack knocked on the door of his tent. The old veterinarian had been awake for hours, staring at the canvas ceiling and fighting memories that surfaced like demons in the darkness. Tommy's face, the screech of brakes, the bottle of whiskey he'd emptied that night 10 years ago. "I heard the radio," Sam said simply, his voice hoarse from sleeplessness. Esther emerged from her quarters with the efficiency of someone who'd spent decades responding to medical emergencies. Her gray hair was already pinned back, and she carried a field medical kit with the practiced ease of a former trauma nurse. "How far?" she asked Jack, falling into step beside the two men as they headed toward the jeep. 40 minutes if we push it," Jack replied, his military training evident in the crisp way he checked his equipment. Rifle secured, radio charged, emergency supplies loaded. But something in his gut told him this wouldn't be a routine animal rescue. The drive across the savannah was a bone-jarring journey over roads that existed more in theory than practice. As they bounced through dried riverbeds and around termite mounds the size of small buildings, Sam found himself gripping the door handle with white knuckles. Not from fear of the terrain, but from the growing certainty that whatever they found at Water Point 7 would force him to confront the very skills he'd sworn never to use again. "There." Jack pointed ahead to where a cluster of acacia trees provided the only shade for miles. Even from a distance they could see the problem. A lioness lay on her side beneath the largest tree, her golden coat matted with dried blood and dirt. Her massive mate paced in a wide circle around her, occasionally stopping to sniff the air and release a low, rumbling growl that spoke of frustration and growing desperation. "Jesus Christ," Esther whispered, her professional composure cracking slightly. In 30 years of nursing, she'd seen countless difficult births, but never under these circumstances. "Jack, how close can we get?" The ranger killed the engine 50 yards from the trees and studied the scene through binoculars. Males agitated but not immediately aggressive. "He's protecting her, not hunting us." He lowered the glasses and looked at Sam. "Doc, what do you think we're looking at here?" Sam's hands began to shake as he focused on the lioness. Even from this distance, her distress was obvious. The way she held her back legs, the irregular breathing, the dark staining around her hindquarters. "Difficult labor," he said quietly. "Possibly breech presentation. Without intervention." He didn't finish the sentence. "Without intervention, she dies," Esther said bluntly. "And probably the cubs, too." Jack started the engine again. "Then we call in the Kenya Wildlife Service. They have veterinarians trained for this." "Nearest KWS team is in Nairobi," Sam replied, never taking his eyes off the lioness. 8 hours minimum, assuming they drop everything and fly out immediately. He was already mentally cataloging the supplies in his medical kit, running through procedures he'd performed hundreds of times on domestic animals, but never on a 400-pound predator, never with her protective mate standing guard. As if responding to his thoughts, the male lion suddenly stopped pacing and stared directly at their vehicle. Even at 50 yards, his amber eyes seemed to burn with intelligence and warning. This was his territory, his mate, his cubs. The message was clear. Approach at your own risk. "We should call this in and wait for proper backup," Jack said, but his voice lacked conviction. They all knew what waiting meant. Esther was already checking the medical supplies. I've assisted with emergency C-sections but never field surgery. Sam, can you do this?" The question hung in the air like a challenge. Sam closed his eyes and saw Tommy again, felt the steering wheel slick with blood in his hands, heard the sirens that came too late. When he opened them, the lioness was looking directly at him, her eyes holding the same desperate trust he'd seen in his grandson's face before everything went dark. "I can try," he whispered. Jack keyed his radio. "Base, this is Ranger 1. We have a medical situation at Water Point 7. Request immediate backup and clear the channel for emergency traffic." As they began unloading the medical equipment, none of them noticed the faint glint of sunlight reflecting off glass in the hills beyond the acacia grove. Someone else was watching. Someone with very different intentions for the lion family struggling beneath the thorny branches. The decision to approach hung in the air like a death sentence none of them wanted to sign. Sam's hands trembled as he sorted through the medical supplies, each instrument bringing back memories of procedures gone wrong, of the day his confidence died, along with his grandson. The lioness, whom Esther had quietly begun calling Amani after hearing a local worker use the Swahili word for peace, lay motionless, except for the labored rise and fall of her breathing. "We need to talk about this," Jack said, his military training warring with his conservation instincts. Approaching a distressed lioness with her mate present goes against every protocol in the book. Even if we succeed, we could be creating a dependency that disrupts their natural behavior. Esther was already laying out surgical instruments on a clean cloth, her movements precise despite the tremor of adrenaline in her voice. "Honey, I've seen that look before. She's been in labor too long. The cubs are positioned wrong, and she's losing strength." She glanced up at Sam, her eyes holding the weight of 3 decades in emergency medicine. "How long do we have?" Sam studied Amani through the binoculars, his veterinary training automatically cataloging symptoms. Based on the bleeding and her posture, maybe 2 hours before she goes into shock. After that, he set down the binoculars and met their eyes. "After that, we're looking at recovery time instead of rescue time." The male lion, Django, had positioned himself between his mate and the humans, but his behavior puzzled them all. Instead of the aggressive posturing they expected, he seemed almost expectant. Every few minutes he would look back at Amani, then return his gaze to the humans, as if weighing some impossible decision. "That's not normal territorial behavior," Jack observed, lowering his rifle slightly. "It's like he's asking for help." The radio crackled to life with a burst of static, followed by an urgent voice from base camp. "Ranger 1, we've intercepted radio chatter about poacher activity in your sector. 3-man team, armed, possibly targeting the lions. ETA unknown, but proceed with extreme caution." Sam's blood ran cold. In all his years of practice, he'd never had to perform surgery with armed criminals lurking nearby. But as he looked at Amani struggling beneath the acacia tree, another image superimposed itself. Tommy lying in the hospital bed, machines beeping frantically while doctors worked to save what couldn't be saved. "I can't watch another life slip away because I was too afraid to act," Sam said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of 10 years of regret. "Mary always said I ran toward broken things I couldn't fix. Maybe that's exactly what I need to do." Esther reached over and squeezed his shoulder with surprising strength. "Then we do this together, but we do it smart." She turned to Jack. "What's our security situation?" Jack scanned the surrounding terrain through his scope, noting potential cover points and escape routes with practiced efficiency. Hills to the north could hide a sniper position. Open ground to the south offers no cover but clear sight lines. If we're doing this, we need to move fast and stay alert. The breakthrough came when Amani herself made the decision for them. With what seemed like tremendous effort, she lifted her massive head and looked directly at Sam, then slowly, deliberately, She shifted her position slightly, an invitation or a surrender, they couldn't tell which. Django's reaction was immediate. He stopped pacing and sat down, his golden eyes fixed on the humans but no longer showing aggression. "Did you see that?" Esther whispered. "She's asking us to help." Sam was already moving, his medical training overriding the fear that had paralyzed him for a decade. "Jack, I need you to maintain position here with the rifle, not to shoot them, to watch for the poachers. Esther, you're with me. If this goes sideways—" "It won't," Esther said firmly, falling into step beside him as they began the longest 50-yard walk of their lives. "I didn't survive raising 3 teenagers and nursing through 2 epidemics to die being helpful to a cat." As they approached, the magnitude of what they were attempting became clear. Amani was enormous up close, her paws the size of dinner plates, her breathing shallow and rapid. The smell of blood and birthing fluids mixed with the musky scent of lion, creating an atmosphere that was both primal and intimate. Django watched their approach with the intensity of a guardian angel, but made no move to attack. When Sam knelt beside Amani and gently placed his hand on her flank, the male lion actually stepped closer, as if offering protection rather than threatening harm. "Well, I'll be damned," Esther breathed. "In all my years, I've never seen anything like this." Sam's examination confirmed his worst fears. The cub was breech, too large for natural delivery, and Amani was rapidly approaching the point of no return. But as his hands began the delicate work of repositioning the unborn cub, he felt something he hadn't experienced in 10 years. The possibility of redemption. That's when the radio crackled again, and Jack's voice carried a new edge of urgency. "Doc, we've got company. 3 armed men, northeast ridge, about 800 yards and closing. Whatever you're going to do, you need to do it now." The race against time had become a race against death itself, with poachers closing in and a lioness's life hanging in the balance. Sam's hands moved with the precision of 4 decades of veterinary practice, but his heart hammered against his ribs like a caged bird. Amani's amber eyes never left his face as he worked to reposition the breech cub, her massive body trembling with each contraction. The irony wasn't lost on him. Here he was, trying to bring life into the world while armed men approached with death on their minds. "Talk to me, Jack," Esther called softly, her hands steady as she monitored Amani's pulse. Despite her 72 years, her nursing instincts had kicked in with the reliability of muscle memory. "How much time do we have?" 600 yards and moving tactical." Jack's voice carried the controlled tension of his military training. Through his scope, he could see 3 figures moving with the practiced stealth of professional hunters. Lead man's carrying what looks like a high-powered rifle. "These aren't amateur poachers." Sam felt the cub shift slightly under his manipulation, and Amani released a low moan that was more relief than pain. "Come on, sweetheart," he whispered, using the same voice he'd once used to comfort frightened animals in his clinic. "Work with me here." The cub's position was improving, but the process was agonizingly slow. Django had positioned himself where he could see both the approaching threat and the medical procedure, his massive head swiveling between the two with obvious anxiety. What struck Sam as remarkable was the male lion's apparent understanding that the humans helping his mate were separate from the humans stalking them. Intelligence like that shouldn't have surprised him. He'd seen it in domestic animals countless times, but in a wild predator it was breathtaking. 400 yards, Jack reported, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "Doc, I'm going to need you and Esther to be ready to move." Fast. But moving was the last thing Sam could do. His hands were literally inside the lioness, guiding the cub into proper position for birth. Any sudden movement now could kill both mother and baby. "I can't stop, Jack. We're at the critical point." Esther had been thinking the same thing. How long for the birth, Sam? If everything goes right, maybe 20 minutes. If something goes wrong, he didn't finish the sentence, but they all understood. Complications in veterinary obstetrics could turn 20 minutes into 2 hours, or end in tragedy in 5 minutes. The radio crackled with intercepted chatter from the poachers' communications. The voices were speaking in rapid Swahili, but Jack's years in Kenya had given him enough of the language to understand the gist. They're not just hunting, Doc. They're on a schedule. Someone's paying them for specific parts, and they need the male alive for transport. That revelation hit Sam like a physical blow. He'd heard rumors about the illegal trade in lion parts for traditional medicine, but the reality of it, armed men hunting this magnificent family for their organs, made his stomach turn. "Over my dead body," he muttered, then caught himself. That might be exactly what they were looking at. Amani suddenly tensed, her breathing becoming rapid and shallow. Sam felt the cub shift again, and this time it was moving in the right direction. "Esther, I can see the head. We're close." 300 yards, Jack's voice was tight with concentration. "They've split up. 2 coming from the northeast, 1 circling to flank from the south. Professional formation." Esther was already thinking tactically, her mind processing options with the clarity that comes from decades of emergency medicine. "Sam, can you deliver this cub and move immediately afterward?" "If everything goes perfectly, yes, but Esther, there will be bleeding." "Amani will be vulnerable for at least an hour after delivery." Sam's hands continued their delicate work even as his mind raced through scenarios. "And there's usually more than one cub." Django's behavior suddenly changed. The massive male rose to his feet, his nostrils flaring as he tested the wind. He'd caught the scent of the approaching humans, and his posture shifted from protective to predatory. But instead of moving away from the humans helping his mate, he positioned himself between them and the threat. "Jesus Christ," Jack breathed. "That lion just... He knows. He actually knows we're trying to help." The first cub emerged in a rush of fluid and blood, tiny and perfect and utterly still. Sam's heart sank. They'd been too late. But Esther was already moving, her nursing instincts taking over as she stimulated the cub's breathing with the same techniques she'd used on human babies decades ago. After what felt like an eternity, the tiny lion released a weak, mewling cry. Amani's head snapped around at the sound, and she immediately began the instinctive process of cleaning her newborn. The sight of the massive predator gently licking her cub with overwhelming maternal tenderness brought tears to Esther's eyes. "Well, I'll be damned," she whispered. "Life finds a way." But there was no time to celebrate. Sam could feel the second cub positioning for birth, and Jack's reports were becoming increasingly urgent. 200 yards, they've stopped to set up what looks like a shooting position. "Can you take them?" Esther asked, her voice steady despite the circumstances. 3 against 1, with them having the high ground? "I'm good, but I'm not superhuman." Jack's military training was clear in his tactical assessment. "Best case scenario, I take 1 down and buy you maybe 10 minutes before the other 2 flank my position." Sam felt the second cub beginning to emerge, but something was wrong. This one was larger, and Amani was already exhausted from the first delivery. "This isn't going well. The second cub is stuck." That's when they heard the voice calling across the savannah, amplified by a bullhorn and speaking in accented English. "We know you're there. Step away from the lions and nobody gets hurt. We just want the male." The voice belonged to Marcus Kane, though none of them knew his name yet. What they heard was desperation masked as authority, a man trying to sound in control when everything in his life was spiraling toward disaster. The 48 hours until Sarah's deadline loomed in his mind like a death sentence, making him dangerous in ways that went beyond simple greed. "Like hell," Sam muttered, his hands working frantically to free the stuck cub. He could feel Amani weakening beneath his hands, her breathing becoming labored. They were losing her. Esther made a decision that would have surprised her children, who'd always seen her as the careful, rule-following mother. She stood up, her gray hair catching the afternoon sunlight, and called back across the savannah. "You want these lions? You'll have to go through a 72-year-old woman from Georgia. And let me tell you something, honey. I buried one husband and raised 3 teenagers. You don't scare me one bit." The silence that followed was broken only by Amani's labored breathing and the distant sound of wind through the acacia trees. Then came laughter from the ridge. Not cruel laughter, but the sound of someone genuinely caught off guard. "Ma'am," Marcus called back, "I respect your courage, but you don't understand what's at stake here." "Try me," Esther shot back. "I've got all day and a dying lioness who needs our help more than you need her husband." That response seemed to give Marcus pause. Through his scope, he could see the elderly woman kneeling beside the lioness, her hands stained with blood as she assisted what was obviously a difficult birth. It wasn't the scene he'd expected to find. His mission parameters had never included dealing with geriatric veterinarians and elderly nurses. Sam finally managed to free the second cub, which emerged in a rush accompanied by significantly more bleeding than he was comfortable with. This cub was larger than the first, but also stillborn, its tiny body limp and unresponsive. Esther immediately began resuscitation efforts while Sam worked to control Amani's bleeding. 3 cubs, Sam announced quietly, feeling the third beginning to move. "This is going to kill her if we can't speed this up." Django seemed to understand the urgency. The massive male lion moved closer to his mate, lying down beside her and beginning to lick her face and neck in what could only be described as comfort. The sight of such tenderness from a creature that could kill any of them with a single swipe was both beautiful and heartbreaking. Jack's voice crackled over the radio with new urgency. "Movement on the South Ridge. They're repositioning for a clear shot. Doc, whatever you're going to do, you need to do it in the next 5 minutes." The third cub began to emerge just as the sun started its descent toward the western horizon, painting the savannah in shades of gold and crimson that would have been beautiful under any other circumstances. Sam could hear his own heartbeat in his ears as he guided the tiny life into the world, knowing that every second could be their last. The third cub emerged alive but barely breathing, its tiny chest rising and falling with desperate irregularity. Sam's hands moved with practiced efficiency, clearing the airway while Esther worked frantically on the second cub, which had begun showing signs of life after 5 minutes of intensive resuscitation. Amani, despite her exhaustion, immediately began cleaning her newborns with an intensity that spoke of pure maternal instinct. "That's it," Sam whispered, his voice hoarse with emotion. 3 healthy cubs. But even as he said it, he knew their ordeal was far from over. Amani had lost significant blood, and her breathing remained shallow. She needed rest, fluids, and time to recover. 3 things they didn't have. Jack's voice cut through their moment of triumph. "Contact imminent. They're moving down from the ridge." 2 minutes, maybe less. Through his scope, he could see the lead figure clearly now. A man in his 50s, well-equipped and moving with military precision. This wasn't some desperate local poacher. This was professional. "Sam, can she move?" Esther asked, checking Amani's pulse with growing concern. The lioness was alert but clearly weakened by the traumatic birth. Not for at least an hour. Maybe longer. Sam's veterinary training told him what his heart didn't want to accept. Moving her now could restart the bleeding. We could lose her. Django seemed to sense the approaching danger more acutely than any of them. The massive male rose to his feet, his golden eyes fixed on the ridge where the hunters were descending. A low rumble built in his chest, not quite a roar, but something that seemed to vibrate through the ground itself. It was a sound that spoke of absolute determination. That's when Marcus Kane stepped into view, his rifle trained not on the lions, but on the humans protecting them. At 55, he carried himself with the confidence of someone accustomed to getting what he wanted. But there were stress lines around his eyes that spoke of desperation poorly concealed. Behind him, two local men armed with older rifles took flanking positions. "Dr. Mitchell, I presume?" Marcus called out, his voice carrying the polished accent of Silicon Valley education. "Your reputation precedes you. 3 decades of veterinary practice, specializing in large animal obstetrics. Graduated summa cum laude from UC Davis in 1978. Sam's blood ran cold. This wasn't a random encounter. Someone had done research, had planned this. "Who are you?" Marcus Kane, former CEO of Kane Technologies, current desperate husband. Marcus lowered his rifle slightly, a gesture that might have seemed conciliatory if not for the steel in his voice. "My wife has approximately 46 hours to live without treatment that costs $50,000. Treatment that American insurance companies have deemed experimental and therefore not covered." Esther's nursing background made her acutely aware of medical desperation, but she kept her voice steady. "And you think killing these lions will solve that problem?" "I know it will." Marcus's voice cracked slightly, revealing the emotion beneath his controlled exterior. "Traditional Chinese medicine pays premium prices for lion organs from healthy adult males. One animal provides enough funding for Sarah's treatment in Germany." Jack had positioned himself where he could maintain visual contact with all 3 poachers while staying partially concealed behind a fallen log. His military training told him this was about to escalate beyond words. "Doc, whatever you're planning to do, now would be good." But Sam wasn't planning anything except the impossible, protecting a lion family while somehow preventing bloodshed. His hands remained gentle on Amani's flank, monitoring her recovery even as his mind raced through options. "Mr. Kane, I understand desperation, but there has to be another way." "There is no other way." Marcus's voice hardened. "I've sold everything. Lost the house, the business, liquidated retirement accounts. This is it. This is the last option." That's when Django made his decision. The massive lion rose to his full height and began walking directly toward Marcus, his golden eyes locked on the armed man. Not stalking, not hunting, walking with purpose and what could only be described as dignity. "Jesus," one of Marcus's men whispered, raising his rifle. "Boss, he's coming right at us." "Nobody shoot unless I give the order," Marcus commanded, but his own hands were trembling on his weapon. He'd hunted before, but never had prey that seemed to be communicating. Django stopped 10 feet from Marcus and sat down, his massive head tilted slightly, as if studying the human. The silence stretched between them, broken only by the sound of wind through the acacia trees and the soft mewing of newborn cubs. "What the hell is he doing?" Marcus muttered, his finger hovering over the trigger. Sam realized what was happening with a clarity that took his breath away. "He's asking you to reconsider. That lion is literally asking you not to destroy his family." "That's impossible," Marcus said, but his voice lacked conviction. The intelligence in Django's eyes was undeniable, and the way the lion held himself, proud but not aggressive, powerful but not threatening, spoke of a consciousness that Marcus hadn't expected. Esther struggled to her feet, her joints protesting after kneeling beside Amani for so long. "Mr. Kane, I've been a nurse for 30 years. I've seen what desperation does to people, how it makes them consider things they never thought possible." She took a step toward him, her gray hair catching the late afternoon sun. "But I've also seen miracles happen when people choose compassion over violence." "Miracles don't pay for experimental cancer treatments," Marcus replied, but his rifle had lowered slightly. That's when Sam made the decision that would change everything. Rising slowly to his feet, his hands still bloody from the delivery, he began walking toward Marcus. "You're right. Miracles don't pay medical bills. But sometimes people do." Jack's voice crackled with alarm. "Doc, what are you doing?" "Something I should have done 10 years ago," Sam called back, never taking his eyes off Marcus. "I'm choosing to help instead of hiding behind fear." Marcus raised his rifle again. "Stop right there, Dr. Mitchell. I don't want to hurt you, but I will if you interfere." "Mr. Kane, 10 years ago I made a choice that killed my grandson. I was drunk, behind the wheel, and too proud to call for help." Sam's voice carried across the savannah with the weight of absolute honesty. "Tommy was 8 years old, and he trusted me to get him home safely. I failed him in the worst possible way." The confession hit Marcus like a physical blow. He'd been prepared for resistance, for heroic speeches about conservation, for anything except this raw honesty about failure and guilt. "I've lived with that guilt every day since," Sam continued, still walking slowly forward. "And I've learned something about the difference between making things right and making things worse. Killing this lion family won't save your wife, Mr. Kane. It will just create more death, more grief, more families torn apart." "You don't understand," Marcus said, his voice breaking. "Sarah is everything to me. Our son died when he was 6. Leukemia. We couldn't afford the experimental treatments then either. Insurance companies called it not medically necessary. We lost Tommy because we weren't rich enough to save him." The revelation hung in the air like a bomb waiting to explode. Two men, both named their lost children Tommy, both carrying guilt that had shaped their lives in opposite directions. Django chose that moment to stand and approach Marcus again, this time coming close enough that the man could feel the lion's breath on his face. Instead of attacking, the massive predator simply looked into Marcus's eyes with an expression that seemed to hold infinite sadness and understanding. "He knows," Esther whispered. "That lion knows what loss feels like." Marcus's hands began shaking uncontrollably. The rifle that had felt so solid in his grip moments before now seemed to weigh 1,000 pounds. Behind him, his two hired men exchanged uncertain glances, clearly out of their depth in this emotional standoff. That's when the radio crackled, with an incoming transmission that would change everything once again. The satellite phone in Marcus's pack erupted with an urgent ringtone that shattered the tense silence like breaking glass. His hands trembling, Marcus fumbled for the device while keeping his rifle partially trained on the group. The caller ID displayed a number he'd memorized by heart. Mercy General Hospital, Oncology Ward. "Sarah?" Marcus's voice cracked as he answered, his professional composure finally crumbling completely. "Marcus, where are you?" The voice that came through the speaker was weak, barely above a whisper, but carried the desperate urgency of someone running out of time. "The doctors, they say I need to make a decision about the ventilator. They're saying it might be time to—" "No." Marcus's refusal came out as a roar that startled even Django, who took a protective step back toward his family. "Sarah, no, I'm handling this. I'm going to get the money for Germany." "Just hold on a little longer. Baby, I'm tired." Sarah's voice carried the weight of 6 months of chemotherapy, radiation, and false hopes. "The pain is— Marcus, maybe it's time to let go." The words hit Marcus like physical blows. He dropped to his knees in the African dirt, the rifle forgotten beside him as he pressed the phone to his ear with both hands. "Don't you dare give up on me, Sarah Kane. Don't you dare. We promised each other we'd fight this together." Sam, Esther, and Jack exchanged glances, suddenly understanding that they were witnessing something far more complex than a simple poaching operation. This was a man watching his world disintegrate in real time, thousands of miles from the woman he was desperate to save. "Marcus?" Sarah's voice grew fainter. "I need you to promise me something. If I don't make it, if the treatment in Germany doesn't work, promise me you won't spend the rest of your life angry. Promise me you won't become someone I wouldn't recognize." Marcus looked up at the group surrounding him, the elderly veterinarian with blood on his hands from delivering cubs, the gray-haired nurse who'd stood up to armed men, the former soldier who could have killed him but chose restraint. Then his gaze fell on Jengo, the massive lion who'd approached him with what could only be described as understanding. "I don't know how to promise that," Marcus whispered into the phone. "I don't know how to live without you." "The same way I learned to live without Tommy," Sarah replied, her voice growing stronger for a moment. "By helping other people's children, by making sure other families don't go through what we did." Esther couldn't stand it anymore. The nurse in her, the mother in her, the human being in her demanded action. She approached Marcus slowly, her hands visible and empty. "May I?" she asked, gesturing toward the phone. Marcus looked at her with confusion and suspicion, but something in her weathered face, perhaps the recognition of shared suffering, made him hand over the device. "Sarah, honey, my name is Esther Johnson. I'm a nurse from Georgia, and I'm here with your husband." Esther's voice carried the same gentle authority she'd used with thousands of patients over the decades. "Can you tell me about your treatment options in Germany?" For the next 5 minutes, Esther engaged Sarah in the kind of detailed medical conversation that only someone with extensive healthcare experience could manage. She asked about tumor markers, treatment protocols, insurance appeals, and patient advocacy programs. Marcus listened in growing amazement, as this stranger demonstrated more knowledge about his wife's condition than some of the doctors they'd consulted. "Sarah," Esther finally said, "I want you to know that your husband came here because he loves you. But honey, there might be other options we haven't explored. Medical tourism isn't just about paying cash for treatment. There are foundations, clinical trials, compassionate use programs." "We tried everything," Marcus interjected, his voice hollow with exhaustion. "Every foundation, every trial, every program. Sarah's cancer is too rare, too advanced. Germany is the only place doing the experimental immunotherapy that might work." Sam had been listening while monitoring Amani's recovery, but something in Marcus's desperation reminded him of his own darkest moments. "Mr. Kane, what if I told you there might be another way to get that $50,000? A way that doesn't require killing anyone?" Marcus laughed bitterly. "Unless you're secretly a millionaire, Dr. Mitchell, I don't see how that's possible." "As a matter of fact," Sam said quietly, "I am." The words hung in the air like a challenge to reality itself. Jack's head snapped around to stare at Sam, and even Esther looked surprised. Marcus struggled to his feet, still clutching the phone. "What are you talking about?" Marcus demanded. Sam's hands found Tommy's baseball cap, adjusting it with the nervous gesture that had become habitual over the past decade. "Medical patents, veterinary surgical techniques, licensing agreements with pharmaceutical companies." His voice was matter-of-fact, as if discussing the weather. "When you develop new methods for treating livestock diseases, and those methods get adopted globally, the royalty checks add up over 40 years. "You're lying," Marcus said, but his voice lacked conviction. "Mary always said I was terrible with money. After she died, I discovered we had accumulated significantly more than I'd realized." Sam met Marcus's eyes directly. "Approximately $2.3 million, most of which I've been too guilt-ridden to touch since Tommy's accident." The silence that followed was broken only by Sarah's weak voice from the phone speaker. Marcus, what's happening?" Esther gently took the phone back. "Sarah, honey, I think we might have found you a guardian angel." But that's when the tragedy struck. One of Marcus's hired men, clearly agitated by the turn of events and worried about losing his payment, made a fatal decision. Raising his rifle toward the group of lions, he fired a single shot that echoed across the savannah like thunder. The bullet struck Amani in the shoulder, sending the exhausted lioness sprawling. Her newborn cubs, scattered by the impact, began crying in thin, desperate voices that cut through everyone's hearts like knives. Django's roar of rage and anguish shook the ground beneath their feet as he charged toward the shooter with lethal intent. The gunshot's echo hadn't faded before Django was airborne, 400 pounds of pure fury launching toward the shooter with the explosive power that made lions apex predators. Marcus's hired man, a local poacher named Kimani who'd been promised easy money, had time for one terrified scream before the massive male lion's claws raked across his chest, sending his rifle spinning into the dirt. "No!" Marcus shouted, but his voice was lost in the chaos. Jack was already moving, his military training taking over as he sprinted toward the confrontation. Sam threw himself over Amani's wounded form, trying to shield the lioness and her cubs from further violence, while Esther dropped to her knees beside the scattered newborns, gathering them against her chest like precious cargo. Django could have killed Kimani in seconds, but instead of delivering a fatal bite, the lion stood over the wounded man with his massive jaws inches from the poacher's throat. The message was clear. This was restraint, not mercy. The great cat's amber eyes blazed with intelligence and controlled rage as he looked from the shooter to Marcus, as if asking what justice should look like. "Call him off!" Kimani screamed, blood streaming from the claw marks across his chest. "Please, call him off!" But Marcus was staring at something else entirely. Amani's shoulder was bleeding heavily, the bullet having torn through muscle and possibly nicked bone. The lioness who had just given birth to 3 cubs, who had trusted these humans enough to accept their help, was now paying the price for that trust. The cubs' desperate mewing filled the air as they tried to crawl back to their wounded mother. "Sarah, I have to go," Marcus said into the phone, his voice hollow with shock. "Something terrible has happened." "Marcus, wait!" Sarah's weak voice was cut off as Marcus ended the call, his hands shaking as he stared at the scene before him. Sam was already assessing Amani's wound, his veterinary training overriding the chaos around him. The bullet passed through the shoulder muscle, missed the major arteries, but she's losing blood fast. His hands moved with practiced efficiency, applying pressure to slow the bleeding. "Esther, I need the surgical kit. We have to operate immediately." "Are you insane?" Jack shouted from where he was keeping Django's second accomplice at gunpoint. "You can't perform surgery on a wounded lioness in the middle of this mess." But Esther was already moving, her gray hair wild from the chaos, but her movements precise with professional determination. "Sam's right. If we don't stop this bleeding, she'll die in minutes." She began laying out surgical instruments with the same calm efficiency she'd shown during the birth. "And those cubs won't survive without their mother." Marcus found himself in a nightmarish situation he'd never imagined. The plan had been simple: obtain the lion organs, sell them for medical funding, save Sarah. Now he was watching a wounded lioness bleeding out while her mate stood guard over a man Marcus had hired, and the very people he'd threatened were trying to save the animal he'd come to kill. "This is insane," the second accomplice muttered, his rifle lowered but not abandoned. "This wasn't the deal, Kane. You said it would be quick and clean." "Shut up," Marcus snapped, but his attention was focused on Sam's desperate efforts to save Amani. The old veterinarian was working with a speed and precision that spoke of decades of experience, but his hands were shaking. Whether from adrenaline, exhaustion, or emotion, Marcus couldn't tell. That's when the most extraordinary thing happened. Django, still standing over the wounded Kimani, suddenly lifted his massive head and looked directly at Sam. Then, with deliberate care, the lion stepped away from his captive and approached the surgical area. Instead of interfering, Django lay down beside his mate, positioning himself where he could watch both the humans working on Amani and the threats surrounding them. "Jesus Christ," Jack breathed. "That lion he's helping. He's actually helping." Sam didn't have time to marvel at Django's behavior. The bleeding was worse than he'd initially thought, and Amani's breathing was becoming labored. "Esther, I need sutures, the big ones, and prepare a pressure bandage." His voice was steady, but everyone could hear the underlying desperation. As Sam worked, memories flooded through him unbidden. Tommy's last surgery, the one that had failed despite every medical intervention available. The helpless feeling of watching life slip away despite having all the tools and knowledge to prevent it. His hands had shaken then too, not from inexperience but from the crushing weight of responsibility. "Talk to me, Sam," Esther said quietly, recognizing the signs of a medical professional fighting his own demons. "What do you need?" "I need time to turn back," Sam whispered, his voice so low only she could hear. "I need to be the doctor I was before I started killing the things I loved most." "Honey, you didn't kill Tommy," Esther replied firmly, her hands assisting with the sutures while her voice provided the kind of grounding that only someone who'd seen similar trauma could offer. "And you're not going to let this lioness die either." Marcus watched this exchange with growing understanding. These weren't just random volunteers. They were people carrying their own burdens, their own guilt, their own desperate need for redemption. The realization hit him like a physical blow. He'd come here planning to take life, but he'd found people dedicated to preserving it. The surgery took 45 minutes. 45 minutes during which Django never moved from his protective position, during which the cubs gradually quieted as Esther kept them warm against her body, during which Marcus found himself holding pressure bandages and following Sam's instructions without conscious decision. When it was over, Amani was stable but weak. The bullet wound was closed and dressed, the bleeding controlled, but her recovery would take weeks. Sam sat back on his heels, his surgical gloves stained with blood, and for the first time in 10 years, he felt like a doctor again, instead of a man haunted by failure. "She'll live," he announced quietly. "But she needs rest, antibiotics, and careful monitoring." Marcus looked around at the aftermath of his failed mission. Kimani was wounded but conscious, his chest bandaged with supplies from their medical kit. His second accomplice had lowered his weapon entirely, clearly wanting no part of whatever this situation had become. Amani was alive but injured because of his choices. And somewhere in a California hospital, Sarah was waiting for news about a treatment that now seemed both possible and unnecessary. "Dr. Mitchell," Marcus said finally, his voice rough with emotion he'd been suppressing for months. "Were you serious about the money? About helping with Sarah's treatment?" Sam looked up from where he was monitoring Amani's vital signs. "Mr. Kane, I've been carrying guilt about Tommy's death for 10 years. I've been looking for a way to make amends, to use the resources I have for something meaningful." He gestured toward the Lion family, now reunited and quiet. "This seems like exactly the kind of thing Mary would have wanted me to do." "But why?" Marcus asked. "Why would you help someone who just threatened to kill you?" Esther answered before Sam could speak. "Because, honey, pain recognizes pain, and sometimes the only way to heal your own hurt is to help heal someone else's." Marcus pulled out his satellite phone with trembling hands and dialed the hospital number. When Sarah's weak voice answered, he was crying openly for the first time since their son had died. "Sarah, baby, I need to tell you something. We're going to Germany. We're going to fight this cancer together. And I need to tell you about some very special people I met today who reminded me what being human actually means." As the African sun began its descent toward the horizon, painting the savannah in shades of gold and crimson, Two families, one human, one lion, began the slow process of healing from wounds both physical and emotional. 6 months later, the morning sun painted the Kenyan savanna in the same golden hues that had witnessed one of the most extraordinary days in the lives of everyone involved. Sam Mitchell stood beside the acacia grove where it had all happened, watching three healthy lion cubs play under their parents' watchful eyes. At 6 months old, hope, faith, and courage, the names Esther had insisted on, were growing into magnificent young lions, their golden coats gleaming in the early light. "Hard to believe it's been half a year," Jack Thompson said, joining Sam at the observation point. The former Marine had a different look about him these days. The haunted expression that had plagued him since Afghanistan had softened into something resembling peace. His daughter Zoe, now 17, stood nearby with her camera, documenting the lion family for her college application essay about life-changing experiences. "Dad, look at how Django watches over them," Zoe called out, her voice filled with wonder. "It's like he knows exactly what each cub needs." She'd arrived 3 weeks ago for her first visit to Kenya, initially reluctant to spend her summer vacation in what she'd called the middle of nowhere. Now she was talking about changing her major from business to wildlife biology. Sam smiled, his weathered hands steady as he made notes in his daily observation log. The tremor that had plagued him for years had gradually disappeared over the months spent caring for the lion family. "Your father saved my life that day, Zoe, not just from the poachers, but from myself." The sound of an approaching vehicle interrupted their morning routine. A dust cloud marked the arrival of the weekly supply truck, but today it carried passengers. Marcus Kane stepped out of the passenger seat, followed by a woman who moved carefully but with obvious determination. Sarah Kane had lost her hair to chemotherapy, but her eyes held the bright clarity of someone who'd looked death in the face and chosen to fight. "Dr. Mitchell?" Sarah called out, her voice stronger than it had been during that desperate phone call 6 months ago. "I hope you don't mind unexpected visitors. Marcus insisted we needed to see this place for ourselves." The reunion was emotional for everyone involved. Marcus, who'd lost 30 pounds during Sarah's treatment and looked older than his 55 years, embraced Sam with the fervor of someone greeting a brother. "The experimental treatment worked," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "The German doctors confirmed it yesterday. Sarah's cancer is in complete remission." Esther emerged from the research station where she'd been preparing morning medications for the animals. At 73, she moved with the spry energy of someone who'd found new purpose in life. Her gray hair was pulled back in a practical bun, and she wore the kind of utilitarian clothing that had become her uniform during her extended stay in Kenya. "Well, I'll be damned," she said, embracing Sarah with the gentle care of someone who understood the fragility of recovery. "You look absolutely beautiful, honey. How are you feeling?" "Like I've been given a second chance at everything," Sarah replied, tears streaming down her face. "And it's all because of what happened here. Because Marcus met people who showed him that there's always another way." The transformation in Marcus was perhaps the most remarkable of all. The desperate, dangerous man who'd arrived with rifles and threats had evolved into someone dedicated to protecting the very animals he'd once hunted. His new wildlife security company employed former poachers as rangers, providing legitimate income for people who'd previously survived by illegal hunting. "We've had 0 poaching incidents in this sector for 4 months, Jack reported with obvious pride. "Marcus's intel network and security protocols are better than anything the government agencies had in place." Kamani, the man who'd shot Amani, approached the group with obvious nervousness. His chest still bore scars from Django's claws, but he wore the uniform of Marcus's security company. "Dr. Mitchell," he said in heavily accented English, "I want to apologize again for what I did. The lioness, is she—" "See for yourself," Sam said gently, gesturing toward the acacia grove where Amani rested in the shade. The lioness bore a barely visible scar on her shoulder, but she moved with all her natural grace. When she spotted the humans, she lifted her head in acknowledgement, not fear but recognition. "She remembers us," Esther marveled. "After all this time, she still remembers." What happened next silenced everyone. Django rose from where he'd been lounging with his cubs and began walking directly toward the group. But instead of approaching Sam or Esther, the massive lion walked straight to Sarah Kane. He stopped 3 feet away and sat down, his amber eyes fixed on her face with an intensity that was both gentle and profound. "What's he doing?" Sarah whispered, not daring to move. Sam's voice was filled with wonder. "I think he's saying thank you. You're the reason Marcus stopped hunting. You're the reason this family is still alive." Sarah slowly extended her hand, palm up, in the universal gesture of peace. Django sniffed carefully, then did something that defied every expectation. He gently touched her palm with his massive paw. The contact lasted only seconds, but it felt like a blessing exchanged between two survivors who understood the preciousness of life. "My God," Marcus breathed. "How is this possible?" "Animals know," Jack explained, his military pragmatism softened by months of witnessing similar interactions. "They can sense things about people that we can't even articulate. Django knows Sarah's story. He knows she fought the same fight his family did, the fight to survive against impossible odds." The cubs, emboldened by their father's example, began approaching the group with the fearless curiosity of young animals who'd known only kindness from humans. Hope, the smallest of the three, walked directly to Zoe and began sniffing her camera with obvious interest. "Can I touch her?" Zoe asked, her teenage bravado replaced by genuine awe. "Let her decide," Sam advised. "If she wants contact, she'll let you know." Hope rubbed against Zoe's leg like an enormous house cat, purring with a sound that seemed to vibrate through the ground. The teenager's face lit up with pure joy as she gently stroked the cub's golden fur. "Dad, this is incredible," Zoe said to Jack. "No wonder you wanted to stay here. This is where miracles happen." The afternoon was spent sharing stories and updates. Esther's children had finally visited, bringing her grandchildren to meet the famous grandma from the lion story that had been featured in National Geographic. The reconciliation had been tearful and complete, with her daughter admitting that they'd been too busy with their own lives to appreciate what they had. "I realized I was about to lose the most important person in my family," Esther's daughter had told her during that reunion. "When I saw you on the news, standing up to armed poachers to protect those lions, I knew I'd been an idiot. You're not the burden I thought you were. You're a hero." Sam had used part of his resources to establish a permanent veterinary clinic at the preserve, staffed by rotating volunteers from American veterinary schools. The Mitchell Clinic had become a model for wildlife medical care, treating everything from injured elephants to orphaned baboons. "The best part," Sam explained to Sarah and Marcus, "is that every life we save here feels like a small redemption, not just for the animals, but for all of us." As the sun began its descent toward the western horizon, painting the sky in familiar shades of gold and crimson, the group gathered around a small campfire. The lion family rested nearby, close enough to be part of the conversation, but far enough to maintain their wild dignity. "I need to ask you something," Marcus said to Sam as they watched the cubs play in the fading light. "Why did you really help us? You could have let the authorities handle everything, could have stayed safely out of the way." Sam was quiet for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the lions. "Because 10 years ago I was driving drunk with my grandson in the car. I hit a tree at 60 miles per hour. Tommy died instantly, and I walked away without a scratch." His voice was steady now, the old guilt transformed into something useful. I've spent a decade wishing I could trade places with him, wishing I could undo that moment. I can't, but I can make sure that when someone else's family is in danger, I don't stand by and watch. And I learned that sometimes the people who seem like enemies are just other people fighting for the things they love, Marcus added. Sarah and I lost our son to cancer when he was 6. For years I blamed everyone, doctors, insurance companies, God, myself. When Sarah got sick, all that anger came back. I thought the only way to save her was to take what I needed, regardless of who got hurt. Sarah took her husband's hand. But the real lesson was that there are people in this world who will help strangers for no reason other than it's the right thing to do. Sam paid for my treatment without knowing anything about us except that we were desperate. Esther poked at the fire with a stick, her expression thoughtful. You know what I think? I think we were all meant to find each other. 4 broken people and a lion family who needed saving. Sometimes the universe puts exactly the right people in exactly the right place. As if responding to her words, Django lifted his massive head and released a gentle rumble. Not quite a roar, but a sound that seemed to carry across the savannah like a blessing. His cubs responded with their own soft calls, and Amani added her voice to the family chorus. They're saying goodbye, Jack observed. They know you're leaving tomorrow. Not goodbye, Sam corrected, watching as Hope approached their group one final time. They're saying thank you, and so am I. All of us saved each other that day. The stars began appearing in the darkening sky, the same stars that had witnessed the birth of cubs and the rebirth of human spirits. In the distance, the sounds of the African night began their ancient symphony. But around the small campfire, 2 families, one human, one lion, rested in the peaceful knowledge that love, courage, and compassion could indeed triumph over fear and desperation. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but tonight, all was well in their small corner of the world. At 68, Dr. Sam Mitchell thought his best years were behind him, haunted by guilt, living alone with memories of a grandson he'd lost to his own mistakes. Sound familiar? How many of us carry that weight, believing we're too old to matter, too broken to heal? But in the African savannah, kneeling beside a dying lioness, Sam discovered something profound. It's never too late to become the person you were meant to be. When he chose courage over comfort, purpose over self-pity, everything changed. Not just for him, but for everyone whose life he touched. This isn't just a story about lions. It's about us. About Esther, 72, estranged from her children until she found her voice again. About Marcus, who almost destroyed everything until strangers showed him another way. About the transformative power of choosing hope when hope seems impossible. We're not done yet, friends. Our wisdom, our experience, our capacity to love, these are gifts the world desperately needs. Age isn't the end of our story. It's the beginning of our most important chapter. What moment in your life taught you it's never too late to start over? Have you ever found unexpected purpose when you least expected it? Share your story below. Your experience might be exactly what someone else needs to hear today.